get a word on this story and the other big stories of the day. Fraser Myers is with us, Deputy Editor of Spiked Online. Fraser, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
All good at this end. Nice to have you with us. I mean, firstly, were you surprised by this poll?
No, I wasn't surprised, actually, even though it is a major moment. Things have been trending in this direction for a while, especially under the Labour government. I mean, you know, so two things, of course, have been happening. One is the rise of reform, but also the utter collapse of Labour. I think, you know, British politics in this era, pretty much really since Brexit, has been so volatile. Parties can rise and fall, you know, within the space of months. Just cast your mind back to 2019 when it looked like the Conservatives were riding high. Everyone was talking about Boris Johnson being in for 10 years or more, you know, striding like a colossus across British politics. In as recently as 2021, the Tories were winning by-elections off Labour. Fortunes can change very quickly because we don't have the same loyalty to the parties that we used to. We also know that I think there's a broad sense that the two mainstream parties have failed quite spectacularly. Labour have been even worse than many people's lowest expectations. So there's a bit of and some people are surprised by that. So people are going to look for new parties and new things. And maybe, you know, maybe the same could happen to Farage as well. Yeah. Well, let's have a listen to Nigel Farage. This was last June, of course, when they overtook the Tories for the first time. Far less than they're polling now. But let's have a listen to what Nigel Farage said back then.
We have now overtaken the Conservatives. We're in second position in the country. In fact, we're leading the Conservative Party in every single region apart from Scotland. This is the inflection point. The only wasted vote now is a Conservative vote. We are the challengers to Labour, and we're on our way.
The problem with all of that, though, Fraser, is that, I mean, it sounds correct based on this polling, but, of course, if you look at our electoral system and how people vote, and there was an election tomorrow, the likelihood is Reform would come back with some more MPs, but it would still be probably a landslide for Labour. Yeah, and that's what I suppose Nigel Farage is trying to get at. He's saying that, you know, previously the Tories would have been able to say, well, you know, if you're on the right, voting for reform is letting Labour get in. What Farage is trying to say is that actually, no, the vote for the Tories is a wasted vote. If reform is second in your area, you should vote for them. So, you know, there could be a point where we have seen in history in British politics where one party has displaced another. The Labour Party displaced the Liberal Party as the sort of centre-left party over 100 years ago. Could the same happen for reform? Again, the system delivers these huge, actually quite disproportionate results. I mean, I'm looking at some of the polling and, you know, when it's put into seats, it looks like reform at the moment would be on about 70 seats or something like that, which is obviously far better than they are now. But as you say, quite rightly, that's not going to get a governing majority. It would still put Labour and keep Labour in power. And, you know, given that that's the case, it doesn't seem like Labour is going to want to change the voting system anytime soon, even though they've flirted with that idea in the past. And, of course, the obvious answer from an instinctive perspective would be, well, why don't the Tories and Reform just link up and then that's the problem solved? But despite many Conservatives moving over to Reform, there's a whole lot of Conservatives, and particularly the sort of One Nationer MPs, that wouldn't touch Reform UK with a barge pole.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they wouldn't touch Nigel Farage with a barge pole. They think that actually some of them are quite glad to see the back of the more right-wing Tories. I mean, my sense is actually that wing of the Conservative Party is probably what is holding them back more than anything else. But, you know, we shouldn't forget there are many people in places like the home counties who want to vote for a more sort of respectable-looking party. They associate Nigel Farage with populism, with sort of thuggery. I think it's a bit condescending and prejudiced, but that is ultimately how some people see it. And, you know, the Tory party does have to straddle these two wings of, you know, quite wealthy people versus the more sort of populist end of the spectrum. Yeah, and I guess that phrase "common sense," you know, that Trump kind of, you know, there was a great moment in one of his rallies leading up to the election where he simply looked at the crowd and said, "I speak your language," and it was almost as an aside. I think as he was getting a round of applause, he just threw it out there.
And I thought, that's it, right there, in a nutshell. I speak your language. Nigel Farage has that amazing ability to, even if you disagree with him, to come across as a bloke that's preaching common sense. Migration, it's off the scale. Woke issues, it's off the scale. All of these areas, he sounds as if he's speaking the language of ordinary people.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the leaders of the other parties, you feel like everything they say is fed through so many different advisors, so many different focus groups, that it no longer comes out as as the language of ordinary people. I think, what is it, Keir Starmer said during this AI summit, he talked about it being mainlined into the DNA of the nation. I mean, it was so clangish, it was so bad and bizarre, and it made no sense. Whereas you're right, someone like Farage speaks very fluently, often what appears to be off the cuff.
Yep.
And people, even if they don't like him, they admire that, and they find that engaging. Keir Starmer doesn't really engage anyone.
No.
Kerry Badenoch's interesting in the sense that you see a lot of focus groups say that people want to hear more from her, but she doesn't seem to have that much to say at the moment. So, let's see how she develops.
Yeah, I mean, we could dress all of this up in, it's still early days, 6 months in from a general election. But it's interesting, Fraser, story 2 here, pubs that could ban customers from talking about religion and transgender rights. This is under Labour's workplace harassment reforms, because it might upset members of the bar staff who get a little bit twitchy if somebody starts talking about things they find uncomfortable. That's a great example, isn't it, of why Reform UK are riding ahead, because they are the party that speaks out most robustly against this kind of nonsense, and that would be in part responsible for their star rising even further.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, people see huge problems with whether it's wokery or migration or various contentious issues. And if the governing class's response is to shut those conversations down, that doesn't make people think, oh, well, I'll stop talking about it then. It just makes you more angry. It makes you feel even more passionately about whatever issue it may be.
Yeah.
Crackdowns on free speech do not work. If we actually wanted to stop people having certain ideas, it's the worst possible way to go about it. But, really, pub should be a place of free discussion. It's not just pubs. I mean, it could be anywhere where you might encounter hospitality staff or other people. Football stadiums,
But how did we arrive in this place, Fraser, where somebody is saying, let's make a rule that if you've upset some staff, therefore you've broken some kind of rule, or it could be used in a discrimination case against the employer, which is ultimately, I suppose, where these kind of laws end up, in a tribunal sort of setup. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers. Everyone you meet, every sane person you meet, knows it's bonkers, and yet here we have a government that's trying to get this kind of guff into law.
Yeah, so what it actually started with was around sexual harassment. So it said that employers basically have a duty to prevent sexual harassment of their staff, which I think is actually pretty reasonable.
Fair enough, yeah.
But then what gets tacked on is this broader concept of harassment as defined under the Equality Act. And then that's what brings in these ideas around race, trans, religion. And therefore you can't have conversations, or potentially can't have conversations about that might cause upset to staff. So people like the Free Speech Union have wondered, will pubs have to employ banter bouncers to be able to detect what we're allowed to say and what we can't?
I'd love to be a banter bouncer. I'd probably get fired, maybe after about 3 minutes, as I'm sure you would as well. But it's a nice thought of giving it a go. Just your job is literally to earwig people's conversations in case they have some hurty words in them.
Yeah, and I think both of us would be far too liberal and let people carry on.
Yeah, that would be a problem.
The place like the pub really should be a place for free and robust discussion. Having chats about politics with your mates is pretty essential. I mean, this is where we thrash things out. It's where also where we counter sort of bad ideas. If someone comes up with some mental conspiracy theory about something, it's better that they express it down the pub and a mate has a word with them and says, not sure about that, than it is just people just mouthing off on the internet about things or just expressing things into the void.
Indeed.
So why would you want to crack down on conversations in pubs? It's perfectly healthy. and a good thing for democracy.
Indeed. Stay with us, Fraser. We've got more stories to come. Fraser Myers is with us. He is the deputy editor of Spiked Online.